Ladies and gents, let's answer that question that gets put to me regular. I'm going to start doing this at the end of each guide series. So we finished the Rogue a few days ago, moving on to the Paladin now. But we want to answer that question that's actually the overall question. Should you roll a Rogue? Should you give it a try? Should you investigate it? Preach chose it as his main class for Walls of Draenor. How does he feel about it? How does he feel about the other classes? It was something that people responded to really well during the Warlords beta. It's just general discussion about the class, how I feel it's going. And so far, fingers crossed, we actually got it pretty spot on. So I'm pretty happy with how I looked at the classes. Not egotistical, but we did okay. We did pretty well. So, the Rogue. I chose it as my main. Now, if I was to check a forum, which many of you do, you would probably be under the impression that rolling a Rogue would be a bad idea. And in fact, the forums, wherever you investigate Rogues, are in fact in complete disarray as to the unhappiness of various Rogues, asking for changes, and then being in total dismay when Blizzard did respond. In fact, it was Community Manager Law, you might remember him from TankSpot, who actually said, Rogues are fine, we're not touching them, they're absolutely okay. And people going, what? Outrage, man, what the fuck? Rogues are not in a good place. How dare you, we demand changes. As with every class in the game, every single class in the game, there is always going to be something that's not quite perfect, right? We all want the perfect class. Are we to be angry at that idea? No. Everybody who plays a certain class wants their class to be ideal. And that's never going to happen. Let's face facts. That is never going to happen in the history of time, ever, has somebody been completely happy with everything. That's never happened. And certainly not on the internet, and certainly not when everybody can throw their hat in and have a little discussion about it. So, bearing that in mind, how do I feel about it? What are the good points? What are the bad points? And then we're also going to add in something which I think is going to be quite fun, is predictions over the course of the expansion based on how it is now. And then we can kind of look back and see whether or not that was what worked out based on a gut feeling that I've got right now. So, first of all, the advantages. There is definitely worthwhile rogue spots, at least one, in every single mythic raid, which is where you should all be aiming. If you're going to roll a character and you want it to be your main, or you want it to be your raiding character, are you going to get a raid spot? It's pretty important. Is your class, like, dispensable? Some would argue yes, and it's difficult to say that that's not true. Yes, there is definitely other classes that can replace a rogue. Is it because they will do their job far better? No. That's not the case. It's just the case that we are certainly on par with others. We are. Whether or not people want to look at sim-crafted numbers or whatever, which is always a danger, and to say, well, rogues don't have a spot. They do. They're absolutely great for WoD mechanics. Something that spreadsheets tend not to take into account is how the fights actually work, okay? How the fights actually work rather than just simulated numbers plugged into a spreadsheet. And the fact of the matter is, rogues work really well. They do. They are significantly advantageous in nearly every fight in Highmaul. I've done the Blackrock Foundry, every single boss on the beta, and it was fine there too. Rogues have no problem with how these fights work. None at all. And in fact have many tools that make them advantageous to that. Be it tricks of the trade when being thrown up on Kargath, be it some shadow step and sprinting on the Butcher to maintain really reduced downtime. Yeah, whether it be excessive cleave on Tectus, whether it be simply not taking any damage or being at risk of death on the Twin Ogron, being able to counter many of the magical debuffs that go on inside Kara, and as similarly with Imperator, in which case we have a lot of cleave, we also have a lot of magical resistance, we have a lot of inherent magic damage reduction, which means that we are stalwart, we are sturdy, we're not going to die. I've said this on many occasions on various fights is, look, nothing here can kill me. The only way I'm going to die on this fight is if either I do some colossal fuck up, in which case I deserve to die, or the tanks died or we're wiping anyway. In terms of actual mechanics, I ain't going to die here. It's almost impossible unless I make some colossal mistake. And that's a wonderful feeling. You can look at things like the Twin Ogron Mythic when you've got things like Enfeebling Roar up and there's a big Pulverize coming and it's going to be a shitload of damage. All that kind of stuff coming at once, and some classes are like, my personals are on such a long cooldown and all that kind of stuff. Where I've got Feint with Elusiveness, 30% reduced damage. I also got Cloak if I need it. I don't take damage from Blaze. I don't do this. I don't do that. And it's all good. If you look at things like Mythic Kargath, we can soak Blade Dance with Evasion, increasing favor for the whole raid. We can Tricks an entire side without having to take the spot of a Hunter who's doing obviously much more beneficial things downstairs with the cats. All that kind of stuff. Soaking Cleave. It goes on and on. The list of tools and abilities available to the rogue is absolutely fantastic. Now, how are the specs? The specs are actually pretty good. pretty damn good. We've got choices. It's nice. Irregularly in High Mall right now, and will continue into the Blackrock Foundry, I'll be playing 2 specs. I'll be switching between sub and combat because each of them has their uses. And that's nice. There's variation every time I log in. I always think that's important on your main classes, that you have some variation. Classes can get very stale very quickly, but if every raid night, unless it's progress on one particular boss, you're able to switch around, that's nice. Sometimes I'm playing sub, that piques my interest, that renews my thinking about that spec, and then I switch over to combat, I renew my thinking about that. My timers are different all the time. It's very, very nice. The drawbacks. Why are people complaining in general? That's a big thing. Why are people moaning in general? One, gearing has been particularly awful for rogues in High Mall, and it's not likely to get better in the Blackrock Foundry, unfortunately. Which means that although Assassination, which some people say is dog shit, it actually isn't. Assassination has its place in a High Mall raid. It's very capable of doing very, very nice damage on certain fights. Things like Bracken Spore, you can put nice bleeds up. On Ogron, it has its place. Not the best, but certainly has its place should you want to do it. The problem is you can't gear for it in any way. And the way gearing works right now, especially in terms of enchants and rings, and not rings, enchants and gems, all that kind of stuff, is it's so expensive, then it just has to be left in the dust. Despite the fact occasionally, I know this spec is quite worthwhile here, I would like to play it, but I can't. I can't gear for it, and therefore I'm going to be really at a substantial loss by trying to force it through my current gear setup. We're not too bad right now with getting some decent multi-strike, which is hopefully going to be not a continuous theme of WoD. I think if we're going to remove reforging and all that kind of stuff, it'd be very, very nice, very, very nice further down the line to make stats far more equal. It's unlikely to happen, I know that, but it's certainly a drawback of the rogue is gearing. Other classes seem to have a better time with it, not ideal by any means, but gearing on a rogue is an absolute nightmare. It's really horrific, and once you start trying to make yourself into the best you could possibly be, you hit huge stumbling blocks where it's like, this is going to cost me 30,000-40,000 gold, or a shitload of resources that I'm farming myself through garrisons to make this a worthwhile transition, and that's not really worthwhile. I'm hoping for multiple weapon drops or coin drops in order just to spread my enchants around and make sure I'm not using things like a big axe in the offhand for sub, which is a situation I'm in right now, and it's just not nice, honestly. And it's a real big bugbear of mine on my rogue, is I spend a lot of time just looking at my rogue thinking, I should change this, or I should throw 100,000 gold at this in terms of buying a couple of items, and that's not a position you want to be in any state of the game. But we are in that position, and it's not likely to change. That's something you need to bear in mind, is if you like being optimized as best you can be, that's not really going to work out for the rogue. They are a spec that needs to respec, and that is the huge bugbear of people playing rogues, is that other classes can simply adapt their play. You look at a Moonkin, they can easily switch between AoE and single target and do relatively well there. And I'm not saying there aren't other classes with similar problems, but if we need to cleave, we need to respec. If we need to go pure single target, we need to respec, and that's when gearing hits a wall, because you might be really well geared in one spec, but not in the other. And it's something you're going to have to bear in mind, is that the way the stats work right now and the way WoD gearing works is it is a class that needs to respec on an almost fight per fight basis in order to be competitive. Now, you can't do it effectively yet unless you have an abundance of overflowing gear, which nobody's really in at the moment at all in the world. Then that's not going to happen. What you have to do is just make do and live with the fact that you are suboptimal in some area. Yeah, you're suboptimal in some area, and that's something you're going to have to just get over and get on with. But there are other classes in the same position, not just the rogue. But I completely understand why people are pissed that sub is a great mass AoE fight, a mass AoE spec, and a really, really, really fantastic single target spec. But if you want to do consistent cleave, we kind of need to switch over to combat. What about if there's these targets, then maybe I want to give Assassination a whirl, and I just can't do that. And that's sad, because that's not a state we've ever been in for a very, very long time. Very long time. Personally, I don't see it as that big of an issue. Honestly, once I reached a point where I could spec between the two and it wasn't too big of a problem, then it was no issue. Was I ever bottom of the DPS? No, not by a fucking long shot. And that was because the actual mechanics of the fights easily prop up the rogue. They prop it up very nicely, and that's something to bear in mind, is that the mechanics actually favor the rogue. There are great fights for combat and sub, and that is just that's a win for me. As I said, I find that advantageous. I find it very advantageous, and then mixed in with my other skills, I find it very cool. So, what about solo play? I think that's always something to consider while you're choosing a main spec solo play. As with all things, it comes with the DPS caveat that if you want to do things like random stuff, like group finder, as with every DPS, that's usually a pain in the ass. If you're doing it on your own and you're looking for 5-mans or whatever, it's going to take you a very long time. That is the sacrifice you make from being just a DPSer. If you're just doing LFR, if that's your stage of the game, it's actually fine. No big deal. DPS queues for LFR, at least on my realms, are actually very, very fast, so that's not an issue. When I'm out in the world, as with all DPS classes, once you get up over X amount of gear, solo play out in the world becomes incredibly simple. And it's the kind of level people were used to in Mists of Pandaria when they started getting instant timeless gear, is the stuff that's out in the old world, so to speak, although it is still current content, is actually extremely trivial. Very, very trivial content, and you're going to have no problem doing it. It's nice to see once you hit around 670 item level, which people will be creeping up to, anywhere between 665 and 670, you can just cope with absolutely anything. You can solo farm if you've got a ban or anything like that. Those solo elites, you can obviously kill them with a way lower item level, but you'll find you start mincing up the world pretty consistently without much of an issue at all, and that is always going to be great because rogue sustainability while solo is fantastic. You can easily switch between things like leeching poison and of course evasions and all that kind of stuff, is that you can cope with most things. There's been nothing that I've needed group for, despite the fact that there should be group content. I've been able to solo absolutely everything, and therefore I think it's a wonderful class to have solo once you get through the teething problems of being a solo DPSer, which is no different than any other DPSer at all. You do have to contend, though, and I think it's worth bringing up in probably most of these little conversations, is that you are a melee. You are a melee. I had a deep discussion yesterday with one of the better casters that I know regarding the attraction between melee and ranged and his dislike for things like interrupts and being in the flurry. It's no good coming to me if you're, you've been a hunter or a mage or whatever and you're thinking about trying a rogue, because you're going to find it very, very busy. And that puts a lot of players off. Extremely busy out in raids when you're surrounded by all those people and you're doing things like you're going to be the interrupter. You're going to be the guy who's the emergency on Bracken Spore with Flamethrower because you have Sprint and Cloak of Shadows. You have to be very aware of things like that. But you can shine. And I think this is the most important conclusion I can give you. A lot of rogues come and say, well, we're just a dumb spot that fills DPS and anyone else can do it. That is entirely down to you. That is entirely down to you. As I mentioned already, rogues have pretty much, let's just say it, rogues are pretty much the only class in the game that usually has a dedicated thread on every single WoW forum regarding tricks. Tricks that rogues can use to make the fight either easier or improve it in some fashion. And that seems to happen pretty much on every single fight. Every single fight. So we can do a quick rundown of ideas that I know, such as Kargath, which would be soaking Blade Dance. Using soaking Blade Dance with evasion, increasing the favor and DPS of the entire raid. Wonderful ability, doesn't risk anybody, absolutely fantastic. You also have, on the Butcher, nothing major, just Shadow Step and Sprint just before he does his bounding cleave. Tectus, you have the Glyph Cloak of Shadow, so you take way less damage in the final burn phase, which is usually the most dangerous, than other people using the physical damage reduction of Cloak of Shadows, and we have that pretty regularly, which is really nice, plus Shadow Step again, which is absolutely crucial. On Bracken Spore, we can be the backup Flamethrower. We have things that Infecting Spores, which is one of the most damaging abilities in the whole fucking game, is that we can cloak it pretty much every single time that ability's up, usually every 2, which means we take one of the least amounts of damage in the entire raid. Not to mention that fight is particularly good for Smoke Bomb. Not every fight is good for Smoke Bomb, that one is. On Twin Ogron, we can nullify every single Blaze. Blaze is one of the big things on Mythic that people will be dying to, unless they're playing rather well. We take 0 damage from that. 0. If we even get caught out and get 1 stack, we can cloak it off and we take 0 damage. We can also nullify Pulverize. We can also Shadow Step during Empowered Shield Charge to make sure that we never lose DPS time. Yeah? These are the kind of things we can do. On Imperator, we can cloak the Force Novas that make everybody AoE each other. On Karar, we can Cloak of Shadows, expel Fire. We can then feint on expel Frost. We can do all that kind of stuff so we take the least damage in the raid, and also we lose very little downtime. Very, very little. And that's absolutely fantastic. All these tricks are what make a rogue, if you're prepared to do them. If you're just wanting something to stand there and go smack, 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 the rogue probably isn't for you, and you'll be wondering why the other guy is consistently taking, 1, way less damage, and 2, doing way more damage, and is somebody people want around in their raids. Should you roll a rogue? I would. I did, and I love it. I love it, but it's not for everybody. A lot of people see the idea of the rogue being a lot of fun and chopping things up with Blade Flurry, and then they get actually into it, and it's not quite for them, because in order to do really well with it, there is very, very deep technique with it. Very deep technique that takes a while to get used to. What do I think for the future? I have a sneaking suspicion, and this is what I'm going to put out there for what I think for over the course of Warlords of Draenor, is that at some point gearing will actually go very, very favourable to the rogues. It might even be Blackrock Foundry with the abundance of multi-strike on there and sub. It could happen there. Maybe, but I think at some point there'll be a gearing choice where rogues are just suddenly become extremely powerful and are maybe going to be nerfed. I don't suspect buffs. I do suspect that in the future they could be nerfed, and that's something to bear in mind because Blizzard tends to swing that hammer with a mighty, mighty force. Alright guys, thank you for listening. I hope that was enjoyable to you. I hope that gives you a nice overview of what I feel about this class should you play it. I'll see you again.